I started my job at Rainiker Industries with a lot of hope. That hope died 5 minutes into training. Mr. Rainiker likes to monitor his employees to make sure his company is working at utmost efficiency, the perky blonde woman said as we stood in front of my cubicle. So, there are a few unconventional measures you should be aware of. Uh-oh, more drug tests? I really hated peeing in a cup. This is a camera, she said, pointing to the small, circular webcam next to the computer, and a microphone. They'll continually stream to Mr. Rainiker. Don't worry though, he doesn't mind if you take coffee breaks and such. He just wants to make sure that you're not goofing off for hours. I stared at it, my heart sinking. No, I wasn't planning on goofing off, but a camera? Watching my every movement? That seemed insane and possibly illegal. He watches his employees on video? Every day? I asked incredulously. Oh, don't worry about it. You'll get used to it in no time. That's not what I asked. I stared at the camera, and it stared back. Someone could be watching every minute of my day, every nose scratch, every bra readjustment. But then again, this company paid almost $1,000 a week for someone who only had a high school diploma. I sat down at the cubicle. Is there anything else? Just that Mr. Rainiker's office is off limits. He doesn't like to be disturbed, so please don't go to him at any hour. Oh, great. He likes to watch us, but we can't even look at him? Okay, thanks, I said as she hurried away. Then I was sitting in front of the computer. On the right was an older man, and on my left, a woman about my age. They sat in their cubicles, laser focused, eyes glued to the screen, fingers racing along the keys. "Hi," I said softly. They didn't reply. Okay, I get it. This place is kind of intense, but that's what you get when they pay you the big bucks. I glanced up at the camera one last time, then got to work. At around 12:15 p.m., I left to get lunch at Bojangles. As I stood up, I noticed only a few other people were missing from their cubicles, which was weird. At my old job, the place would be a ghost town by 11:55. I got back to the office at around 1:05. I returned to my seat, plopped my Coke on the counter, and turned to the computer. What? A small message had popped up in the right-hand corner. Please do not take a lunch longer than 30 minutes. My heart began to pound. I turned around, as if expecting someone to be standing there, watching every move over my shoulder. But there was no one there. Of course, just the camera, always watching. I leaned towards the woman next to me. Hey, did you know about the lunch roll? Without looking at me, she replied, Most of us do protein shakes. There's a vending machine by the bathrooms. She lifted a white bottle that said soy something on the front, took a sip, and placed it back down, while still typing with her left hand. Really? That sucks. Man, things are strict around here. That's when she finally took her eyes off the screen. She stared at me, long and hard, and then whispered, Don't say that. Why not? Just don't. Then she turned back to her computer and continued typing. Weirdo. I spent the rest of the afternoon working hard on that spreadsheet. At exactly 5 p.m., I shut down the computer, gathered my things, and started for the door. Most of the other employees were still hard at work, but I didn't care. My brain was fried. As I walked towards the elevator, I passed Mr. Rainiker's office. Through the frosted glass, I could see his blurry silhouette in the computer chair. From what I could see, he was an average white man with dark hair and a black suit. He didn't look up at me, or even move, as I passed by. I walked into the elevator, looking forward to a meal that I could spend more than 30 minutes on. The next morning around 10, I decided to take a coffee break. The break room was small, but clean. A pot of fresh coffee sat in the coffee maker, and I poured myself a cup. As I grabbed a few creamers, I heard a voice behind me. "You're the new hire, aren't you?" A tall woman with a husky voice stood there, wearing a skirt that looked about 2 sizes too small. She looked me over, and then broke into a smile. "I'm Becky," she said, extending a hand. "I'm Stella," I said, swirling cream into the coffee. "How do you like it here so far?" "Well, it's actually kind of intense." She shook her head, then pointedly stared at a spot above my shoulder. I turned around. There was another camera. I was about to go for a smoke break. "Want a cigarette?" "Oh, I don't." She grabbed my hand and squeezed it so tight it hurt. Yes, you do. Come on." We made our way out of the building, to the entryway in front. The cold wind swept through, numbing me to the core. She pulled out a cigarette and lit it. Then she pivoted away into a recessed alcove in the brick, and then threw the cigarette on the ground. "What are you doing?" "This is a blind spot," she said, stomping it out with her heel. "The only place in the whole damn compound that isn't visible from the cameras." "They can't hear us?" I asked as I joined her. "Not really. The nearest camera is all the way back there. We should still keep it down though." She lit another cigarette, let the smoke trail off in the wind, and then stomped it out. "Listen, kid. Get out while you still can. You're young, single, no kids, right? You don't need this money. I'm only still here because I've got 3 kids to feed. I actually do have a kid, a 2-year-old son. I'm a single mom." "That's rough," she said. "But I'm telling you, this job isn't worth it. Leave and never look back." With that, she walked past me and headed back into the building. By the time I made my way in, she was already gone. I should have heeded her warning. I should have trusted her. But the dream of keeping Ryan in a good daycare and being able to afford toys and art supplies and all of the things for him was far too tempting. That day, for lunch, I bought one of the awful soy drinks. The next 2 days slogged on by. Boring, but manageable. No more creepy pop-ups. I guess I was working at a pleasing efficiency to Mr. Rainiker. I was just starting to feel good about everything. Then Friday happened. Around 10 a.m., I made my way to the bathroom. While washing my hands, I checked my reflection in the mirror. Dark circles fell under my eyes, and my lips were pale, almost the color of my skin. I hadn't gotten much sleep the night before. I pulled out my pink lipstick, then shook my head. I needed something with more pop. I pulled out my red lipstick and leaned in close, and realized it was a one-way mirror. I could see the faint outlines of something on the other side. long and straight, like a couch or a wall, but I couldn't quite make out what lay beyond. Feeling uneasy, I made my way out of the bathroom. The clacking of keys once again filled the air, and I took a seat in front of the computer. I'd only been working on the spreadsheets for a few minutes when I got a notification. Red lipstick is prohibited in the workplace. I froze. Someone was watching me. Had someone been staring on the other side of that one-way mirror? Or did they just notice now, on the webcam? Was he watching me, right now, from his computer? Hands shaking, I grabbed a tissue and wiped the lipstick off. I waited, wondering if I'd get another message. Instead, the message just disappeared after a few seconds. That day crawled by at a snail's pace. Every few minutes, I found myself glancing at the webcam, wondering if I were being watched. There were at least 50 other employees. How could he be watching each one at the same time? Didn't he have his own work to get done? Unless he keeps an eye on new hires. I glanced around at my desk, then I picked up the tissue box, and, making it look perfectly natural, placed it so that it obscured the camera. Try to watch me now, Mr. Rainiker. Not 5 minutes later, my phone began to ring. As I pulled it out of my pocket, I saw the name, Sunnyside Daycare. My heart plummeted as I picked up the phone. Hello? Hi, Miss Johnson, the voice cheerily said on the other line. I'm just calling to confirm that your husband will be picking up Ryan today. My husband? Yes, ma'am. Your husband is here to pick up your son, but he never signed the form, so we just need your permission to release him. I don't have a husband. I'm not married. Who's there right now? Is he? Oh, that's funny. He just left. Well, next time you come in, can you have him sign the form? That way I don't need to call you. I said, I don't have a husband. I shouted into the phone. Several of the workers turned to stare at me. As soon as I met their eyes, they quickly snapped back to the screen, typing away furiously. Oh, that's strange, the woman said on the other end. We'll look into this matter, thank you. The line then clicked, and I stared at my phone, emotion surging through me. Who the hell was there, trying to pick up my son? I didn't put the pieces together until I turned back to the screen. A new message had popped up. Never block the camera at your workstation, please. There will be consequences. My fear suddenly burned into anger. I pushed myself away from the desk and charged to Mr. Rainiker's office. He thinks he can mess with my kid? As soon as I gave him a piece of my mind, I was calling the police on this entire operation. I stopped in front of the door, staring at his blurred silhouette through the glass. My heart pounded as my hand fell on the doorknob. I can do this. I turned the doorknob and charged in. The blood rushed out of my face. It wasn't a man sitting in the office chair. It was a cardboard cutout. I stood there in the doorway, frozen. The clicking of keys filled the air behind me. Either no one looked up, or they knew that their boss's office was occupied by cardboard. What the hell is going on here? I left work right then and there, called the police, drove straight to Sunnyside Daycare, and picked Ryan up. But when the police got there, the building was empty. Everything was packed up. Rainiker Industries knew I called. even though I was in my car, miles away. I know it. I know they're still watching me. Dad, look at the picture I drew. I put on my best, appraising my son's artwork face, and looked down at the picture he had drawn. I recoiled a little when I saw it, not really sure what to make of it. It was a baby head, like a baby doll, but no body was attached to it. The hair was gone, nothing but dots on the scalp, and the eyes were missing and staring openly. A big silver loop like a smile ran through the head, and the bottom was covered with little metal legs, like spider legs. I looked at it for a minute, wondering what this horrible thing was, but suddenly, it came to me, and I felt a little silly for being anxious. Good job, buddy. Is it the spider baby from Toy Story? Handing it back to him. No, Daddy. It's the monster that comes to my window at night. I sighed audibly. The monster had become a point of contention in our house as of late. Every night for the past 3 weeks, my son had woken up screaming because there was a monster outside of his window. Ever since we had moved into our new house, it had been a regular nightly event, and I had almost started waking up before the screaming. It never mattered how fast I ran, though. There was never anything there when I arrived. He was always sitting up in his bed, pointing out the window and crying about a monster looking in at him. When we got home, he grabbed his tablet and began watching Mickey Mouse Clubhouse, as he usually wanted to do after school. I made sure he was comfortable on the couch and not likely to run out of the front door, and started washing dishes. Between the three of us, we usually make a fair amount of dishes. I was just finishing up when my wife came home, grimacing at the picture on the fridge as she came in. That's an interesting piece of work, she said, kissing me on the cheek. Apparently, that's the monster that's been waking him up every night, I said, making her frown as she sat at the table. Ah, the monster? Again? This seriously has to stop. We have to do something about it. I shrugged, tossing the drying rag into the sink. I wish I knew what. What if you spend the night in there tonight? I looked dubiously at her. What, like on the floor or something? No, you could sleep on the other bed in there. I always forgot there were 2 beds in my son's room. They were bunk beds, one on the ground level and one on top. One was supposed to be for guests, playmates, or cousins who wanted to spend the night, and the other was for him. In reality, though, it was more of an excuse for my son to pick a bed to sleep in every night. He usually slept on the top bunk, sitting right beneath the window, but sometimes he liked to sleep in the smaller bed at the floor level. Okay, I guess I'll spend the night in there. Promise you'll reward me in the morning? I teased. She said she would and giggled when I kissed her on the cheek. That reward would never come, though. That night, we went through our nightly routine. After dinner, we brushed our teeth, put on our pajamas, and got ready for bed. As I picked up the book and directed him to the loft bed, though, he grabbed my arm and shook his head. I thought he was about to argue about his bedtime. He wasn't a big one for bedtime. Instead, he shook his head and pointed to the bottom bunk. "Can I sleep there?" he asked, pointing to the bottom bunk. I sighed and looked up at the top bunk, wondering how I would get up that tiny staircase. One look at my son, though, showed something serious was going on. He looked scared, too scared for a kid his age, and I was suddenly kind of scared myself. What was so scary about this bed? This wasn't the first time he balked at the idea of sleeping in the loft bed, and I was kind of hesitant to climb in on it. I got over this quickly and told him he could sleep in the bottom bed if he wanted. So, we read our Clifford book, and I turned off the lights, swinging up onto the top bunk as I snuggled down to sleep. For a few hours, I slept fitfully. I was awakened in the dark of the night by a light scratching at the window. It wasn't a loud scraping. It was soft, like something rubbing lightly against the glass as it attempted to get my attention. Maybe a fingernail, maybe a knife tip, but it was consistent in its efforts as it rubbed. After the picture earlier, my mind conjured up an image of a baby head with metal spider legs, scrabbling at the glass. In my dream, it dug perfect grooves into the glass, like a jewel thief in a movie, and it was making progress through the window. The baby's head had a mouthful of metal teeth to go along with its legs. The teeth gnashed at the glass as the legs cut, and I could do little else but lay there and watch him cut through the transparent barrier. I woke up as he scuttled in and leaped on my face, its twisted metal teeth twinkling. When I woke up, I thought the dream hadn't quite ended. The scraping continued, that soft, whispery sound, and I opened my eyes and glanced at the window. I was covered, a pillow over my head, and my eyes peeked from beneath the corner of the blanket. I was still half asleep, and as the crust broke away from my eyes, I thought I still might be dreaming. I saw the baby head, metal legs still scrabbling, pressing against the window. I lay still, watching the little creature bounce off the glass. Its scalp was a stubby patch of yanked out hair. Its blue eye looked straight ahead, placidly, while the other yawned vacantly. The metal legs were bumping and rubbing, making scratching sounds against the glass. They didn't seem as dexterous as they were in my dream. The monstrous thing seemed like a Halloween decoration, something blown by the wind as it swung from a post, and as I watched it shake in spasm, I noticed the ring. The ring from the picture, a thick metal loop, ran through the head and connected it to a thick chain. I looked, following the chain, and the outline of a person began to come into view. He was framed perfectly against the privacy bushes in front of my windows, his clothes blending seamlessly. He was tall, 6 feet at least, and his body was large and looked strong beneath his sweater. His face was doughy and pockmarked as it pressed against the window glass, his tongue wet and forming bubbles as it slid over the filthy glass. His flesh was pressed to the window as he looked into the shadowy room, and his eyes searched for something. Thankfully, my son probably never saw him and had only ever seen the strange baby head necklace. If he had seen this strange face pressed against the window, he would have likely never slept in his bed again. The man's eyes found mine suddenly, his crazed look sobering a little as he realized I was not my son. We locked eyes, and I'm ashamed to say that I did not deliver some piercing look that scared him away. I was just as scared as my son was every night, before he started screaming in my dazed and fearful state. We stared at each other for a count of 5 before he broke and ran off into the night. The police just left, taking a complete statement and checking the bushes for evidence. My son is asleep in my bed, my wife having wrapped him in her protective arms, and I'm sitting on the edge and putting this into words. Tomorrow I'm going to the hardware store. I'll be coming back with wood to board up that window. I don't care if this weirdo ever comes back or not. Before I let my son spend the night in that room, I will make sure no one can ever peek through that window again. Blood. At least, that's what I thought it looked like. An ocean of red, tossing and turning in the field behind my house. At the center of this blood sea, a door, void of any connecting architecture, standing absolutely still, despite the pandemonium unfolding around it. Every so often, the tides would climb the wood and submerge its shape completely. After each dip beneath the waves, it would resurface, closer than before, beckoning me to reach for it and reveal the secrets held within. Soon enough, it filled my field of view. Then, blackness. I always awoke from this dream panicked. Something about it shook me to my core. I didn't want to open the door, but it had this strange hold over me. An unseen force seemed to govern my will. Luckily, in these nightmares, I was never able to turn the knob, always an observer, taking a back seat to the scene itself. And oh, what a horrific scene it was. A feeling more than a view, an indescribable dread that only ever fully set in when I awoke. It was enough to render me stricken with fear on many restless nights. Last night was no exception. The dream came and went, just as it always did. I jumped to a sitting position and gathered my wits. In turning my head towards the bedroom window, I saw it, out in the clearing, halfway between the house and the forest's edge. It was the door, the one from my dream, soaked in moonlight. I couldn't believe it. In an utterly broken state, I rubbed my eyes to make sure I wasn't seeing things. I pinched myself to know that I was awake. Indeed, I was. The sight before me was a real one, just as it had been in my dreamscape. The damn thing called to me, a sickening call that resonated through every last bone in my body. I couldn't fight the insatiable curiosity that overtook me in this moment. It was enough to nudge a frightened child into the dark, or a feeble mouse to birds of prey. A pull so strong, it made me need the door as much as I needed the air in my lungs. A terrible, wicked need. Unable to resist, I ventured out to the field and stepped over to it. My heart pounding so hard, it echoed off the door's wood. Contrary to the signals I sent my body to run, I stayed. Not only did I stay, but I reached for the knob. Luckily, my hand stopped mid-turn. Perhaps it was the adrenaline, or maybe the overwhelming fear that cascaded throughout my body. Either way, I was able to regain my movement and back away from the door. This small victory over the mysterious powers that befell me, however, would be short-lived. It was soft at first, like a creek rolling in the woods, but it grew louder and more powerful. A river, then a waterfall, and finally a dam bursting out into the world, a relentless energy devouring everything in its path. It was a familiar sound, one I knew very well. I turned and saw the blood from my dream. A tsunami of horrific proportions hung in the night air. For just a brief moment, before crashing down to earth, it engulfed my home in seconds. I had no choice at this point. Just before it touched the land at my feet, I opened the door and stepped inside, swiftly closing it shut behind me. I was now an animal caught in the trap of an unknown hunter. A hunter who would soon sink his talons into my flesh. With my hand still against the door, I craned my neck around to survey the area. What I saw was unexpected. It was a room, the kind you might see upon entering an office building. There was a desk with a receptionist, tapping away at a keyboard, and stairs leading up to the next level. But the design, it was all white. I had to turn away at first, blinded by the brightness. When my eyes adjusted, I turned back, and the receptionist took notice. "Oh, hello there. Come, please. I won't bite. I promise." I hesitantly stepped over to the front desk. She smiled. "What is this place?" I asked. She dodged the question. "Sorry for the theatrics. It's the only way we can get people to open the door. The allure isn't enough, it seems. Human fear is the one thing we don't fully understand yet. We're still working out the kinks, you see." I looked at her, confused, not completely sure just what she was rambling on about. "Oh, I almost forgot. You're expected upstairs in room 371. I'll take you there." Before I could object, she walked out from behind the desk and grabbed me by the arm, pulling me up the stairs with a vicious grip, smiling the whole way up. "Don't look so troubled, dear. It'll all be over before you know it. A quick procedure, then you can move on." "Where are you taking me? What is this place? What the hell is going on here?" She smiled again. "You humans are always so inquisitive. Such a strange trait." Soon enough, we arrived at what I presumed was room 371, a black door at the end of a long white hall. The dissonance was unsettling. "Here we are." The receptionist knocked twice at the door. An older gentleman opened it up to greet us. He was maybe in his 50s, well-dressed, gray mustache. "Ah, yes, you must be our latest arrival. How are you?" he asked. "I want to go home, right now," I demanded. The man and woman chuckled. "So strange how they all tend to say that. Well, let's begin." The receptionist handed me to the gentleman and closed the door behind us. I was now in an equally black room, small, maybe 12 meters by 12 meters, with a chair, akin to one in a dentist's office, and a podium behind it, upon which was a device. Before I could get a better look, the man pushed me into the chair. Restraints automatically wrapped around my wrists and ankles. What the hell is this? I tried to break free, but it was no use. "Calm down. You'll only make things worse for yourself. It's best you don't struggle. Not much point in it anyhow." Another individual entered the room, a younger gentleman. "Henry, where in God's name have you been? Quick, come, man the controls." "Yes, sir. Sorry, sir." Henry stepped over to the podium and started adjusting things. The older man walked over to me and smiled. He pulled a sharp silver utensil from his pocket. "Don't fight. It's just a few small incisions. That's all." In a flash, The silver met my forehead. It was over so fast, I barely had time to wince. The man had engraved 3 straight lines into the skin just below my hairline. There, that wasn't so bad. Henry, are we ready? Yes, sir. Everything has been calibrated. Good. I chimed in. Why don't you just kill me already? They both laughed. Then, the older man leaned in. Do you think that's what we're doing? No. We're extracting your soul. But first, we need access to your memories, the powerful ones, the recollections that have stuck with you, even after long bouts of time have passed. I felt Henry place a helmet on me. It shrunk to match the outline of my head. The man gave it a few knocks. This'll show us what we need to see. Then, the pathways should illuminate, a roadmap to the human soul. That's what we need. Fire it up, Henry. Small prickly needles pierced the cuts on my forehead from within the helmet. Then, an image appeared on the black wall ahead, like a projection almost. It was a memory, one of my memories. As I watched awestruck, something happened. My consciousness was seemingly transferred. In an instant, I was transported to the scene, now reliving the moment on the wall. Rebecca and I stared at the farmhouse. It wasn't much to look at, but it had potential. That, and the land around it was vast, surrounded by a beautiful forest. Is it everything you hoped it would be? Rebecca asked, wrapping her arms around me. It is, actually. I put my arms around her waist and turned to meet her gaze. We had been together only a year, but I knew, before this point, I truly cared for her. But in this moment, I fell. Now that we were starting a life together, all bets were off. She was the one, and I couldn't have been happier. I awoke in the black room like a diver coming up for air. My lungs were on fire. Reliving memories was not a painless procedure. No, Henry. What have I told you 1,000 times before? Happy memories won't do. They're not powerful enough. Find me something dreadful, and do it fast before he's a goner. Goner? I asked. The receptionist entered and handed the man a cup, a beverage I can only guess was their equivalent to coffee. Thank you, Mildred. Lord knows I need it. She left. Henry fiddled around at the helm and charted course for a different moment in my past. In an instant, I was transported there. This was one memory I had tried so desperately to forget. It was dark, right around midnight. I woke up to an empty rest of the bed. I assumed Rebecca had gone to the bathroom. I can't explain it, but as I waited for her to return, something felt wrong. The kind of feeling when you enter a room and a picture frame is slightly askew. You can tell something's amiss, but can never quite put your finger on what. I laid there for a long while and let the unrest consume me. It was only then that I decided to get out of bed and see if Rebecca was all right. Something drew my attention to the window, a figure in the clearing behind the house. I stepped over to the glass for a better look and saw it. It was Rebecca, falling from the ground. My heart sank. I raced out of the house, screaming her name. When I reached her, I knelt to the ground by her side. She was covered in blood, holding a kitchen knife. She cried and spoke with what little energy she had left. I'm sorry. I had to. The voices, they wouldn't stop. I had to make them stop. Her voice trailed off. The life left her eyes. She was gone. Once again, I sprang to life in that godforsaken black room, left to reflect on my past. Rebecca was mentally ill. She was seeing a psychologist, but, unbeknownst to me, she had stopped taking her medication. I had no idea her condition would get that bad. I had no idea she would even think of taking her own life. And of course, it was all my fault. I should have seen the warning signs. I should have sought better counsel. I should have gotten out of bed sooner. That's why the nightmare started, I thought. It always took place in that damn field. The wood and the ocean, the same shade as the blood that spilled from her veins. I thought it was a manifestation of my own guilt. She was the door, and that's why I felt the need to come to it. But I knew, just as I had that night, that something was amiss, something that kept me scared of it. My introspection was interrupted by the older gentleman. "Henry, that's it. A perfect memory if there ever was one. Keep going. We need another. Just one more should do it. Look for..." The sound of liquid meeting something electrical filled my ear. Sparks flew into my peripheral vision. The man had spilled his drink on the controls. "Dear God, Henry." "Dear God," I heard Henry say. "Henry, how could you let this happen?" Me? It was then that a new image appeared on the wall, and I was once again transported to another place. This time, I didn't know what to expect. I was drowning in the ocean of red that plagued my nightmares, and there, at the center of the field, was the door, in all of its ominous glory. I tried to swim, but the currents were far too fierce. Whilst treading water, the door opened. My wife, Rebecca, was within. She spread her arms and the waves followed. The sea parted before me, and I landed on the ground below, coughing the contents of my lungs out on the field. I turned to see her stepping past the threshold of the doorway. She walked out into the field, walls of red water on either side of her. Eventually, she just stopped where I was and looked down at me. She was beautiful, just as beautiful as the day we met. "Hello, my love." I tried to respond, but there was still water in my throat. One blink and she was gone. Her voice met my ear from behind. "Why didn't you save me?" I turned and saw her, now bloodied. It was the same state she was in when I found her in the field. "Was I not good enough? Did you want me to die?" I finished clearing my airways and stood, tears rolling down my cheeks. "I'm sorry, Rebecca. I didn't know. She interjected. "That's not good enough." She vanished again. I turned around. She was there, now clean, holding an infant in her arms. "Isn't she beautiful? Her name's Abigail." I trembled. "We never had a child, Rebecca." "You're right, hon. This is the baby I would have birthed had I lived long enough to have her. Don't you remember picking out the names? Jack for a boy, after his father, and Abigail for a girl." I remembered. We laid in the field for hours one night, looking up at the full moon and discussing where our life together was headed. At one point, we talked about children. Rebecca wanted 3, but I insisted on no more than 2. 1 boy and 1 girl. Jack and Abigail. We mapped out their childhoods and pictured every moment. There would inevitably be some tough times, but we agreed it would all be worth it. I remember Rebecca. She walked over to me and handed me the baby. I looked into its eyes. She was perfect. It's hard to say how I knew, but it was her, the same Abigail we pictured years ago. "You should have saved me, Jack. Now, they'll never exist." A harsh wind came from the forest. I watched in horror as Abigail's form turned into dust and blew away through the gaps between my fingers. I had only known her for a moment, but still, I cried. My little girl, gone. Why are you doing this? I pleaded. Her face was now tinged with anger. You deserve to feel the same regret I've felt. I've plunged the blade into my skin, but you could have stopped it. I needed you in that field, and you weren't there. With that, the floodgates opened. A dam of tears burst and streamed down my sides. So too did the blood water around us. It towered overhead for a brief period, before crashing into me. Once above the waves, I watched as Rebecca walked across the water and into that red door. She looked back and offered me one last sentiment. Goodbye, Jack. The torment was now over, but it had taken its toll. I let myself sink into the depths of the ocean. It would be my final resting place after everything that had been dredged up. I truly wanted to die. I kept wavering in and out of consciousness. I could hear Henry and the man arguing. He's not doing so well in there. We might have to cut this one loose. We can't afford the backlash if this gets out. Pull yourself together, Henry. If we can just get one more. One good one. That was the last thing I heard before passing out. For a time, I drifted through the black void of a dreamless slumber. Until, finally, something pulled me out. Rebecca's voice. A thunderous cadence that would have woken even a bear from hibernation. Wake up, Jack! I awoke in a white room, the kind of which I recognized. It was a hospital. It seemed I was being looked after. A nurse was checking my vitals when she looked over and noticed my eyes open. Oh gosh, you're awake. Brilliant. You've been out for quite some time. What happened? I asked in a groggly slur of speech. You were found in the field behind your home, out cold. You've been comatose for nearly 24 hours. I tried pulling myself into a sitting position. She pushed my shoulders back down. Please, rest. You've lost a lot of electrolytes. I'll go get the doctor. She'll help. Just sit tight. The nurse left and I gathered some composure. Comatose, huh? Does the body wonders. Strange nightmares, repressed memories, the works. I let out a morbid laugh, amazed that my brain could even construct such dream worlds. Within moments, the doctor came in and greeted me. She explained my battered state and advised me to stay for observation over the next few days. I agreed. She went over the finer points of my treatment, but then took a detour to ask me a question. Oh yeah, I almost forgot. What happened to your head? My head? I asked, unsure of what she was referring to. It was then that I noticed the faint brush of gauze against my scalp. Here, take a look. She handed me a mirror and carefully removed the bandage. I was mortified by the sight. Above my eyes were 3 perfectly straight cuts, etched across my forehead. Michael Zinsky wasn't my usual type of client. He wasn't a spurned lover looking for revenge, or a murderer looking to snuff out the witness to his crime, or a husband hungry for his wife's insurance policy. He was just an ordinary guy looking out for his sister. I wouldn't normally resort to such drastic measures, but Harold has become so awful, treats her like garbage. He doesn't give a rat's ass about her, or anything, except for that stupid band he sings in with his work buddies. He blew his nose loudly. You understand that, right, Switchblade? I winced. That's just my alias, Michael. You shouldn't, actually call me that in casual conversation. Then what should I call you? I blinked. Clearly, he had never done anything like this before. Do you have the cash? His eyes darted around the diner. Then, from his pocket, he pulled out a wad of $100 bills. You can't just... They'll see it. I hastily threw him one of the napkins. Wrap it up in that, and do it discreetly. He wasn't discreet, but, thankfully, the diner was nearly empty at this hour. It's twice your usual rate, he whispered, very loudly. I wanted to give you a big tip, so you'll do a good job. A tip? You're not ordering an ice cream cone, Michael. You're ordering a hit. But I took the cash, smiled, and buried it deep in my pocket. And I don't want you to kill him. What? Michael, you know I'm a hitman, right? Yes, but Nancy needs his income. She's been a housewife for the past 20 years. No work experience, no education past high school. There's no way she could support herself on her own. You could support her with the cash you just gave me. He shook his head. I've tried. She won't let me. Cares too much. I sighed. Well, okay. Suppose I did take you up on this job. What do you even want me to do to him, if not kill him? I don't know. Scare him. Threaten him. Just make him stop being so terrible to her. But it's risky business. I mean, he'll know what I look like. And you'll go on Sunday morning. He'll be napping alone in the house. Won't even see you come in. Michael looked down at the table and then added, It's the only time he's ever alone in the house. The only time he lets her leave. My belligerence evaporated, and I felt a pang of sympathy. It's that bad? He nodded. Okay, I'm in. The house was a tiny little thing, shoved into the gap between a massive brownstone and a dilapidated food market. It would be a challenge to do it without any witnesses. Good. I like a challenge. I snuck through the backyard, creatively using the various bushes and fences to hide from onlookers. I then stepped into the open window, just like Michael told me to. The knife was heavy in my hands. I turned left at the kitchen and crept into the living room. In the center stood a microphone, a music stand, and some sheet music, presumably from Harold and his band. Nancy's needlepoint supplies was pushed into the corner, taking up as little space as they possibly could. I walked into the next room, and there, in the armchair, sat Harold, fast asleep. I retrieved the chloroform from my pocket. With the grace of a dancer, I lay it against his nose, and then I set to work. I visited Nancy myself a few weeks later. I like to do that sometimes, pose as a friendly neighbor, see how their lives have changed in the wake of my work. Yes, I know it increases my chances of getting caught, but, as I said, I like a challenge. When she flung the door open, her eyes were bright, and she wore a smile. "Hi, I'm Sam Baker," I said. "Just moved here, a few houses away from you, behind the old food mart." "Oh, how nice. Please come in." She led me into the living room, and I smiled. The music stand and other equipment were thrown haphazardly in the corner. Nancy's needlepoint was sprawled across the sofa, taking up as much space as it possibly could. "Smith, this is my husband, Harold." He just stared at me, still, silent, pale. And then he started shaking wildly, clawing at the raw, red mark across his throat. "Oh, sorry, I should explain." She sat down with a small smile. "He's not trying to be rude. It's just that, well, he had an accident a few weeks ago, and now he can't speak, I'm afraid." She patted his arm, comfortingly, as he clung to her. "Or sing, unfortunately." An accident that mysteriously cut his vocal cords and left the rest of him untouched. I could see Harold's hands shaking, his lip trembling. I wonder if he was thinking about the first thing I said to him when the chloroform wore off. "If you don't treat Nancy right, I'll slit your throat again, and next time, you'll lose more than just your voice." I smiled at Harold. "Would you like a cookie?" I asked, holding out the tray. I baked them myself. The iPad looked to be in pristine condition, almost as good as new except for a few scuff marks on the screen. Nothing seemed broken on it, and the picture showed it working perfectly. I knew as soon as I saw it that it had to be mine. Part of my brain told me that it was too good to be true. $40 for an iPad in mint condition? Something's going on here. But the cheapskate part of my brain won over, and eventually, I found myself setting up a meeting place for the purchase. Both me and the owner of the iPad agreed that the best place to meet up would be at his house. Since it was fairly close to my place, and there was no good place to rendezvous between my place and his. He did give me some bizarre instructions for when I arrived at his house. His email told me to grab the iPad off the porch and slip the money under his doormat. When I attempted to ask him why he couldn't just come out and talk to me, he didn't respond. I should probably have had more doubts about the whole arrangement after that, but I was so blinded by such a good deal that I didn't bother asking any more questions. Soon enough, it came time to make the purchase. I drove 15 minutes to his house, which was in a decent enough neighborhood. The lawns were trimmed and the houses looked clean and well cared for. As soon as I pulled into his driveway, however, I could tell that my new business partner's home was the exception. There were weeds growing throughout the cracks in the sidewalk, and the front porch was covered in random junk, like chairs, radios, and other assorted novelties. I wondered why the HOA wasn't on his case by now. As I neared the door, I noticed a putrid smell coming from inside. Resting upon the welcome mat was the glorious box that apparently held my new device. I pulled the $40 out of my pocket and slid the cash under the mat. Before I left, I called out, "Thank you." Then, I booked it out of there and back to my house. The house just gave me a bad feeling, like something bad had happened or was about to happen there. As I was sitting down in the living room getting ready to open up the cardboard box that stored the device, I noticed some words scrawled in large lettering on the bottom that I hadn't seen when I picked it up. "Check the notes app," they read in giant messy handwriting. I was extremely confused by this, but I decided to put the red flags on hold in my mind as I pulled out the iPad. It looked just like the pictures had shown. It was in great working order and only had a few marks on the screen. I turned it on and swiped up to unlock it. I noticed right away that the device had apparently not been factory reset. The wallpaper was customized to a picture of an enormous black lab, and there were a number of apps downloaded that I was certain were not the default iOS apps. I was about to go to the settings to reset the iPad when I remembered the words on the box. I decided, just for the fun of it, to check the Notes app. It probably was just a joke the original owner was trying to pull on me, but I decided to play along. I swiped over to the first screen with all of the default apps, like photos and maps, and I tapped on Notes. Immediately I saw that there were 3 notes. The timestamps on each of them showed that they had been written around the same time, about an hour before I had arrived at the iPad owner's house. I decided to read the notes in chronological order, from the times that they were written. This is an exact transcript of what they said. June 12th, 2021, 12:17 p.m. I need to tell this to someone. I know that no one will believe me, and I'm not sure what good it'll be if you do. I'm too far gone by now anyway. I should probably start at the beginning. I was living a decently normal life. I spent most of my time at home with my dog Lacey, which you probably saw as my wallpaper. I worked from home and was perfectly happy. However, one day, I began to feel extremely odd. My ears would pop randomly and my mouth would dry up. As I was working, I found it harder and harder to concentrate on what I was doing. I'm a very focused person, so this is abnormal for me. My mind would wander to random things and I would lose my train of thought. I didn't think much of all this because I figured I would feel better the next day. But as the hours passed, the symptoms would get worse and I began to feel a headache. I went to sleep, hoping that the rest would make it better. But the next day, my headache had morphed into a pounding migraine. At times, the pain would subside, but after an hour or so, the pain would always come back stronger. This went on for several days. I set up appointments with various doctors who each put me on some generic painkillers. None of the meds ever worked, and I was beginning to get desperate. I started vomiting frequently, and after a week, my vomit began to be mixed with blood. My sickness was progressing quickly, but no doctor or specialist could pinpoint a cause or a solution. All they ever did was give me a prescription for some drug that never did me any good. A few weeks into my illness, I began noticing some bizarre things in and around my house. I occasionally heard footsteps in the night, shuffling along the floor outside my bedroom. Once or twice, I heard a raspy voice echoing from a nearby room. At first, I attributed these weird happenings to my sickness and ignored them. They still unnerved me, but I didn't lend them much thought. All that I was concerned with was finding a cure. I couldn't think of any way that I could have contracted the disease. I hadn't traveled in a long time and I usually keep to myself. I wasn't able to work because of my symptoms, and my life was miserable. I just wanted a way out. That was the end of the first note. I was somewhat confused, but I was also intrigued to see what happened next. I was still sure that it was a prank, albeit a well-written one. I tapped on the next note, wondering what happened in the next issue of this strange series of notes. June 12th, 2021, 12:38 p.m. Like I said, I didn't think much about the voices or the footsteps. I tried my best to ignore them, and eventually they just blended in with all my other miseries. They just became another obstacle preventing me from falling asleep at night. Unfortunately, the sounds only got worse. The footsteps got louder and louder, and the voices became more and more frequent. The voice was raspy, but I couldn't tell if it belonged to a male or female, or if it belonged to someone old or someone young. It was an unidentifiable voice. The voice would say very strange things. I couldn't understand half of its words, but what I could make out disturbed me. It told me that I was worthless. It said that my life only existed as a sacrifice, and that I should just give up. It said that it was always watching me, and that it was waiting for the right moment. What the right moment was, I may never know. I started to call my doctors and told them that I was experiencing auditory hallucinations, but they still couldn't help me. I even talked to a psychiatrist, who provided just as much assistance as everyone else I had consulted. Late on Friday night, I was laying in my bed trying not to vomit when I heard a noise come from outside my room. It sounded like glass shattering. I hadn't heard the voices or footsteps that night so far, but I figured it was just a hallucination. For some reason, however, I felt the strong compulsion to check. I was sure that the noise had come from my den, so I crawled out of bed just to look. It took me a while to get there. I was moving slowly and quietly, because a part of me thought that this could have been a burglary. I couldn't hear anything out of the ordinary, so I continued on. Eventually, I arrived in the den. What I saw shook me to my very core. There was my vase, which had been sitting on top of my end table mere hours ago, laying shattered on the wooden floor. I also knew for a fact that it couldn't have fallen off on its own, because I had placed it as close to the wall as I could in order to keep it secure. I called the police, but nothing came of their investigation. There were no signs of forced entry, and nothing had been stolen or moved besides the vase. After that, I was paranoid. The voices kept coming back. Sometimes, I saw things move on their own accord, just slightly, as if they had been nudged by the wind. I knew that couldn't be the case, however, since my windows were always closed and my air conditioner had been broken at the time. The illness was still increasing in severity, and I thought I was going crazy. My life was miserable. It had been over a month since my sickness started, and things were only getting worse. I considered taking my own life, but I still held on to some small hope that things would get better. Soon enough, I started seeing things. At least, that's what I thought. At first, I was walking down my hall to the bathroom when I saw someone's back around the corner at the end of the hall. I ran after them, but they were gone. The corner rounds off into my kitchen, and there was no sign of the person there. Similar things started happening after that. I'd walk into my room to see someone jumping out of my window, or I would see someone slam the door to a closet as I walked past. When I'd investigate these appearances, whoever it was would vanish. I could never get a good look at the person. They seemed to be short, but I couldn't really tell, and they were always wearing white. I was fully certain that these were hallucinations. I didn't want to believe that I was going insane, but that was the only logical conclusion. I decided to try and photograph these incidents with my iPad. I would keep it in my hands at all times, And every time I saw something strange moving or someone walk around, I would snap a picture. None of these photos ever turned out. I still have them saved on the device you're reading this on. They look completely normal, like pictures of my hall or bedroom. I was living in a nightmare. I was going completely insane. That was the end of the second note. By now, I was very unnerved. If this whole story was true, then why was the guy telling me this? It seemed a bit too bizarre to be real, but I decided to finish reading before making any judgments. I flicked over to the third and final note and began reading the final chapter of this strange series. I don't have much time, but I need to finish my story. I had given up all hope of photographing the sightings. Instead, I did my best to ignore them. In fact, I gave up hope in general. I knew that there wasn't much hope of me getting better. I had to quit my job because I was still sick and couldn't work. I was neglecting my poor dog Lacey. By now I was resigned to my fate. I was sure I would die soon. I'm only writing this out because of what I saw yesterday. I had woken up in the dead hours of the night. My mouth was parched, and I decided to grab a glass of water from the kitchen. I crawled out of my bed, using my iPad screen as a light to find my way. As I stumbled groggily along, I began feeling very sick. I tried to hold back the urge to vomit and pushed on. As I was nearing the corner that turns off into the kitchen, I heard a sound coming from inside. It sounded like a raspy laugh or giggle. I shuddered, but I chalked it up to my hallucinations and entered the room. As soon as I stepped over the threshold into my kitchen, my heart dropped down into my stomach. I pulled up the iPad and took a picture of it, and this time, it finally turned out. I'm not totally crazy. You can see it for yourself. I think I'm being haunted. My hope is that by telling someone else, by sharing my experience, I'll have freed myself. I'm sorry if the ghosts have passed on to you. Maybe they will. Maybe they won't. If they stay here with me, then at least someone else will know what happened to me. Once the sickness begins, there is no escape. Unfortunately, I feel that I'm too far gone anyway, but I still have hope. That was the end of the guy's notes. I was extremely confused, and I had no idea what to think. This had to be fake. Just this guy trolling me. But I decided to give him the benefit of the doubt and check the Photos app, just to see what this mystery picture was. I left the notes and tapped on Photos. The gallery was filled with random pictures of doors, open windows, and hallways. These were presumably the pictures the original owner of the iPad took when he saw those hallucinations. There was nothing abnormal about them. But the last picture was the terrifying one. The sight has given me nightmares. The picture shows a kitchen, with the camera pointing at the fridge. The photo had clearly been taken with the flash turned on, as it showed the body of a girl lit up with artificial light. The girl was wearing a flowing white dress with lace on the collar. She was unnaturally pale, and her hair was jet black. In the girl's hand, the girl was holding a small cloth doll that looked like an exact replica of her with the same clothes, hair, and eyes. These eyes were definitely the creepiest part of the whole photograph. Her pupils weren't black, they were red, and they were staring straight at the camera. Needless to say, I factory reset the device that very day. I couldn't shake the sight of that girl. Every time I close my eyes, I see her staring into my soul. It's a horrible feeling. I decided that the entire story was a prank. The original owner of the iPad had written that whole story and photoshopped a picture just to scare me. I tried to go on about my life normally, but unfortunately, I think the man was telling the truth, and I think his plan worked, because I've recently started feeling very sick, and the usual meds won't cure it. I'm having trouble focusing. I've needed to take the last few days off of work. And what's worse, factory resetting the iPad didn't work, because the picture of the little girl sitting on top of the fridge is still saved on the device. I have no idea what to do. Should I sell the tablet on Craigslist like the man did before it's too late? Or do I keep it here until I die, hoping that the ghosts die with me? I hope someone out there knows what to do. I'm running out of options.